that we don't have any issues with interference. Got background noise from somebody at the moment. Okay guys, I'd like to welcome you all today to the Yealink and Alloy webinar. My name is Scott Young and I'm the Product Development Manager here at Alloy Computer Products. Just a few housekeeping rules before we kick off. Throughout the presentation, all you guys will be muted. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please send through the questions via the question panel. And at the end of the presentation, we will have audio-based questions. Now to do that, if you do want to ask an audio-based question, please raise your hand using the panel that you have on the GoToWebinar application. Okay, today the presentation will be delivered by myself, Scott Young, and we also have Jessica Chen and Elsa Wu from Yealink, who will be here to help out on the chat questions, and also at the end of the presentation they'll help out with some of the Q&A questions as well. Today's webinar will be focusing on auto provisioning of Yealink phones, what auto provisioning features the Yealink phones support, and we'll also have a bit of a look at Yealink's RPS service as well. Okay, to kick things off, let's just talk a little bit about what is auto provisioning. So auto provisioning is used to automatically update IP phones with their configuration settings, and it can also be used to update the firmware in the IP phones. Now the benefit of using auto provisioning, it allows end users to be able to plug in their IP phones without needing to actually configure the phone at all. They can plug it in, and as long as the administrator who is setting up the network has configured the appropriate settings, the phone can auto provision and connect to their IPPBX automatically. Okay, now what does a phone need to actually auto provision? The first thing that it needs is we need a provisioning server. So the phone needs to actually be told where that provisioning server is and what IP address the provisioning server has. Once the phone knows what the IP address is of the provisioning server, it can then contact the provisioning server and ask for a configuration file for its phone. So on the configuration server, we need to make sure that we have a configuration file for all the phones that are trying to connect to it. Once the phone connects to the provisioning server, it then needs to download the relevant files that it needs to provision the phone. Once they've been downloaded, the phone will then apply those settings to its own local configuration file. The phone will then reboot and then start up with all its pre-configured settings. Now, as well as configuring the settings, the firmware of the phone can also be provisioned from a provisioning server as well. Okay, now the Yealink phones support a wide range of provisioning options. First of all, we have Yealink's RPS service. Now with the Yealink RPS service, the phone's firmware needs to support the RPS service. Now Yealink actually offer two different firmware versions, one that supports RPS and one that doesn't. Now if the firmware that you've loaded onto your phones does support RPS, then the phones will provision in the following order. First of all, it will try and contact the Yealink RPS service. If that fails, it will try via 0SP touch, then plug and play server, then DHCP options, and then also the phone flash. Now what we'll do now is actually just dive into some of the details of each of these provisioning features. Okay, first of all, let's talk a little bit about Yealink's RPS service. So the RPS service is an online server that's hosted on the internet. And what that allows, it allows the Yealink phones to connect to the Yealink RPS service. The RPS service can then redirect the telephone to the provisioning server that you have set up in the RPS server. So what happens is if you do want to create an account on the RPS server, you can contact us at Alloy and we can create that for you. Once you have a login on the RPS server, you can then add devices to the RPS server. And by doing that, you enter the MAC address of the phone into the RPS server. And also in the RPS server, you also configure provisioning servers. So we tell each phone, based on its MAC address, to point to a particular provisioning server to find its configuration files. So the benefits of RPS: no need for manual configuration of IP phones. By default, if you're running the Yealink RPS enabled firmware, as soon as the phone boots up, it will automatically try and connect to Yealink's RPS service. Now, as long as a phone has internet access, it can then connect to the RPS service. If the MAC address of the phone is stored on the RPS server, it will then redirect the phone to the configured provisioning server where it can get its configuration. If the MAC address isn't found on the RPS server, then the phone will then boot as normal. Now, by using the RPS server, it allows resellers to be able to pre-configure phones and then ship them out to the customer. The customer plugs them in and bang, they load up and they're configured and running on the network where they need to be. So this allows for a complete plug-and-play installation for the customer. Okay, moving on to the next method of auto provisioning. The next method is zero speed touch or zero SP touch. What this allows us to do is it allows the parameters that you need for the phone to connect to a PBX or to a provisioning server can all be done via the phone's screen interface. So when the phone boots up, as long as zero SP touch has been enabled from within the web interface, when the phone boots up, the user will be prompted with an interface where they can actually enter the provisioning server's IP address and also a username and password if required. So, and as you can see on the screen at the moment, on the left-hand side, the first thing you do when the phone boots is you can either set a static IP address or leave the IP address to be obtained dynamically from a DHCP server. We can then enter the URL of the provisioning server and a username and password if required. So once these details have been entered, the phone then goes off, looks for the provisioning server that's been entered, looks for its configuration files, downloads them, and configures the phone. Okay, the next provisioning method is plug and play. Now, plug and play is going to be probably the easiest provisioning service available on the IP phones. Basically, you turn the phone on, you let it load up, it automatically goes out, contacts a provisioning server, downloads its configuration automatically, and the phone is configured without you doing anything at all. So the way that plug and play works, first of all, what we need to do is make sure that plug and play is enabled from within the web interface of the IP phone. Once the Yealink phones boot up, the phone sends a SIP subscribe message onto the network, and basically it's a multicast or a broadcast address that looks for any provisioning servers that are available on that network. If there is a provisioning server available on the network, it will then reply with a SIP notify message giving the phone the IP address of the provisioning server that's available on the network. It's a very simple process. Okay, moving on to DHCP options. So another method of configuring or provisioning your IP phones is via DHCP options. So we have 3 different options here. We can use DHCP custom options, we can use DHCP option 66, and we can also use DHCP option 43. So the custom options, if you are using DHCP custom options, you need to make sure that you do specify the custom option that you have configured on your DHCP server in the web interface of the Yealink phone. Now, if you're using DHCP option 66, nothing needs to be done on the phone. All that the phone needs to know is that it is actually set up to use DHCP to obtain its IP address. When using option 66, what we need to do is log into our DHCP server and configure that option. So through the scope options on your DHCP server, you can enter the host name or the IP address of the provisioning server that you need your phones to redirect to. Now, once that's done, when a phone boots up, it gets its IP address from a DHCP server, and the DHCP server also tells it its option 66 message. And in that option 66 message is the IP address of the provisioning server that you've configured. So once the phone obtains those details, it goes out, connects to the provisioning server, and again, as long as your configuration files for that phone are on your provisioning server, the phone will pull them down and configure the phone. Now we also have option 43 as well. Now option 43, look, it doesn't get used that often, but what we can actually do is encapsulate vendor specific options inside option 43. Now, I'll tell you the truth, I've never used option 43 before, and I've never known anybody that has used option 43. When using DHCP options, the main option that's used is definitely option 66. Okay, so the last method of provisioning the Yealink phones is via the web interface of the phone. So Yealink call this phone flash, being the configuration details inside the flash, local flash of the, or flash memory of the phone. So what we can do is we can log into the IP address of the phone, bring up the web interface, manually enter the IP address of the provisioning server, and also, if need be, the directory on where your provisioning files reside. Enter a username and password if required. Now, if you are using security, you can also enter your AES keys. Once you do that and hit save, the phone will reboot and then go out and connect to this provisioning server to find the configuration files that it needs. Okay, so they're the main methods that are used for provisioning IP phones. As you can see, Yealink support basically every method there is on the market to provision IP phones. So let's now have a bit of a look at the actual configuration files that are required to reside on those provisioning servers. So when the phone boots up and connects to the provisioning server, it's going to be looking for 2 different files. So we have what we call the common configuration file and the Mac-based configuration file. So the common configuration file can be used to provision settings into the phone that are common for all the phones on your network. So if you have a whole range of SIP-T28s or SIP-T46s on your network and you want to configure global settings for all those phones, that can be done within the common configuration file. Now, any phone-specific settings that need to be set in an IP phone, they will be done in the MAC-based configuration file. So the actual file name of the configuration file will be the MAC address of the IP phone that you have on your desk. So when the IP phone boots up and connects to the provisioning server, the phone will look for the common configuration file, it will apply those settings, and it will also look for its own unique MAC address file. Once it finds that file, it will provision the phone with those required settings. Okay, now, as we know, the MAC address-based file is the MAC address of the actual phone that you're using. Now, with the common configuration file, each model number or different model that Yealink supports has its own unique common configuration file name. So from the list, as we can see, each model has its own configuration file name. Now, you need to make sure that if you do want to use common configuration files, that the configuration files are named correctly for the models that you are using. Okay, so an example of a common configuration file. So what we're doing here in this configuration file is we're telling the phone when it boots up that it needs to go out and upgrade its firmware to the latest version of firmware that we have stored on our provisioning server. So this common configuration file is basically, that's all it's doing. It's telling the phone when it boots up, when it configures, when it connects to the provisioning server, it looks for the common configuration file that we have. Inside that configuration file, all we have is the firmware.url setting, as we can see down near the bottom of the page. And this is telling the phone, please go to 10.2.5.237 and look for the file name 28.71.0.70.rom. Once the phone looks to that firmware file, as long as the firmware file is on the server, it will pull down that firmware file and automatically upgrade the firmware in the phone as well to that version number. Now, there's also a couple of things up the top in the configuration file that need to be there. We can see at the top that hash version 1.0.0.1. That's also a header that needs to be in that provisioning file as well. Okay, guys, so we've kind of gone through that fairly quickly. What we'll do now is we'll open up to some questions from some of you guys in the audience. If you do have any questions, please raise your hands. Okay, Simon, we have a question from you. Fire away, Simon.
Let me take my phone off mute. Just on the redirection server, what happens if you put in a MAC address that already exists, i.e. we acquire a customer from another service provider that's also using the redirect server, and that service provider doesn't remove the MAC address?
Okay, so what we can do is Yealink, we can tell Yealink that the MAC address is already on their server through somebody else's account, and we can get them to remove that, and then you can enter that into your area on the RPS server.
And on the phones, do they come out of the box with DHCP option 66 enabled?
Yes, they do. So by default, all Yealink phones are set to obtain an IP address automatically. So when they boot up, they will connect to a DHCP server. Now, as long as you have option 66 configured on your DHCP server, the phone will then use that option 66. There's no need to actually enable or disable option 66 in a phone. As long as DHCP is enabled, it will always look for that option as long as it's configured on the server. If it's not configured, then obviously it doesn't pull down the settings that are configured in that in that option.
Yep. And on the firmware, so what does the phone do if the firmware.url version is the same as what's already on the phone? Does it still download it and verify it, or
No, it doesn't.
Smart enough to know that it's on the same?
It's smart enough to know. Look, let's just double check that with Elsa from Yealink. Elsa, can you answer that question, please?
Hello. Can you repeat your question again?
Okay, so if a Yealink phone, if there's an option in the common configuration file to redirect to download the latest version of firmware, if the phone already has that version of firmware installed, will it download the firmware again, or is it smart enough to know that it's already running that version of firmware and not apply the firmware?
If you put the firmware in your auto-provisioning server, you will download this firmware again.
So it actually downloads it again, even though the phone's already running that version of firmware.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's all questions from me. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Simon. Okay. So we have any more audio questions? We've got a couple of text-based questions that I can see over here. Let me just go through some of these text-based questions and we'll see if we can answer them. Okay, so Daryl has asked whether the provisioning of the Yealink's RPS service is using HTTPS, and yes it is. It is using HTTPS. Okay, there's now a question from Kilburn. He's asked, how do we know whether the phones have the Yealink RPS firmware installed? We'll go back to Elsa for that one. Elsa, can you please answer that question? So how do we know whether a Yealink phone has the RPS version of firmware installed?
The RPS version, we don't put it into our Yealink site. You have to ask our technical support to send this version.
Okay, so does the firmware file name, is it different to the normal firmware file name, so we can just distinguish between an RPS version and a non-RPS version?
Yes, there are different between RPS version and non-RPS version.
Okay, so the file name is actually different. Okay, so to answer that question, all phones that are actually shipped don't come with RPS firmware. So if you do want to use the RPS service, then you do need to upgrade the phones to an RPS compatible version. Now, any RPS version is available from either Yealink's website and also Alloy's website as well. Okay, another question on the chat line. Sorry, Daryl, that answers your question already. Is RPS firmware enabled out of the box? No, it's not. It needs to be uploaded additionally. And Daryl's also said that being able, when the phone is checking for new firmware, if the firmware file if the phone already has the most up-to-date firmware file uploaded, if it's looking for it again, and downloading it again, it will dramatically increase boot time. It's definitely correct. We need to talk to Yealink and work out a way that the phone should know that the latest firmware is already installed and should skip that step. Also, if you can follow up on that and let me know what the outcome of that is, that'd be fantastic. Okay, question from Richard. Is this documented in full, and if so, is this available publicly for download? Now, Richard, I'm assuming you're talking about the RPS firmware and stuff when we're in your question there. If so, well then yes, basically anybody that's selling Yealink IP phones does have the right to have access to Yealink's RPS service, and there is full documentation on Yealink's website and also on Alloy's website in regards to RPS. Okay, next questions. Okay, there's been another question about the RPS firmware. Now I'll go back to Elsa on this one. Elsa, is Yealink going to ship IP phones with the RPS-enabled firmware built into it?
If you order with RPS version, we can ship you versions with RPS default opened for you.
Okay, well, what we can do is, as long as you tell your account manager at Alloy that you want RPS firmware enabled, then we can make sure here at Alloy that RPS enabled firmware is loaded into the phones before they're shipped out.
Yes, if you want the RPS version, then we can make it default open for you. Enable default.
Yeah, that's something that the Alloy and Yealink would have to organise. But in the meantime, with the stock that we have here at Alloy in the warehouse, if any of you guys do want RPS-enabled firmware, please do let your account manager know, and we'll make sure that firmware is loaded before we ship them out to you. Okay, another question here. Yealink T4 series phones aren't an option on 3.6 version 12 yet. Okay, now as far as I am aware, 3CX are looking at implementing this. Now Elsa, I'm not sure if you have any updates on this, whether you guys are working with 3CX to add the T4 series into the latest version 12 release of 3CX. Do you have any input on that one, Elsa?
About 3CX, we are integrated with our T4 series.
So in the latest version of version 12, or in the final release of version 12 of 3CX, you will have the T4 series built into it as well.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, guys, there's no more chat questions. Any more questions on the audio side? If you do have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or ask them over the chat line if you need to. Okay, so we're going to another question from Kilburn. Now, I'll direct this question to you, Elsa. How long has RPS been around? Is it stable and secure? Also, can SRTP be configured using RPS? Did you get that one, Elsa?
Hello. With our RPS server, it is security with encrypted with HTTPS, and SRTP is encrypt method about phone. It doesn't matter with RPS server.
Okay, so what Elsa's saying is that SRTP can be enabled if you have that parameter configured in your provisioning file, but realistically it has nothing to do with the RPS server itself, because SRTP is actually done between the PBX and the phone, or your carrier and the phone. But RPS can definitely be used to enable that option.
Yes.
Now, in terms of how long RPS has been around for, Elsa, how long has it been now? It's probably 10 months or so, a year.
Who? 1 year warranty. 1 year and a half.
A year and a half it's been around for. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, a question from Daryl. Does Yealink have desk phone brochures for Yealink phones? Yes, we certainly do. Look, there is brochures on our website, obviously, under all the individual phones. There's data sheets and brochures. And we do have hard copy brochures as well. Now, Daryl, if you do need some hard copy brochures, do send me an email and I'll get you in touch with our marketing guys, and we'll see what we can do in sending some hard copy brochures out to you. All right, question from Kilburn. Can we run our own RPS server? Unfortunately, well, you can, but the problem's going to be is when the phone boots up, it's always going to look for Yealink's RPS server because it's been hard built into the firmware to look for that firmware. Sorry, to look for that server. So when the RPS server at the moment is purely a redirection server. So all it's doing is telling the phone to go to another server to get its configuration files. So obviously you can configure your configuration file, your provisioning server on your own and host all your own configuration files. Okay, any last questions before we wrap up? Okay, just before we go on. Okay, so sorry, one more question from Daryl. How do we get RPS firmware? Daryl, please just get in contact with the Alloy technical team and we can point you to the right direction to obtain the RPS firmware. It's on the Alloy website if you want to go there yourself. If not, just give the tech guys a call and we can help you out. Okay, so in regards to our next webinar, there's no planned webinar as of yet, but do check the Alloy website regularly and we will get the next webinar organised and put up there as soon as we can. Okay, another quick question from Daryl. Is the W52 DECT solution supported by RPS? Elsa, can you please answer that one?
Yes. About RPS for W52H that. Does it is question?
Yes. Is the W52 DECT solution supported by the RPS service?
Yes, we can support it.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, guys, if that's about it with the questions, we'll finish up there. I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us for these webinars. I know we've been doing quite a lot of webinars recently, so we will be taking a little bit of a break and coming back to you in a month or so with some more webinars. Okay, thank you guys.